The doctor did not try to soften the words. He didn't lean forward with sympathy or wrap the diagnosis in careful language the way people do in television shows. He simply looked at me across his desk and said, "Your son needs heart surgery. Soon." For a moment, I honestly thought he had the wrong chart. Lucas was sitting in the corner of the cardiology office, swinging his legs from a chair that was slightly too big for him. He had brought his favorite plastic dinosaur with him and was making quiet roaring sounds under his breath, completely unaware that his life had just been reduced to a medical conversation between two adults. The doctor slid a folder across the desk toward me. Inside were test results, diagrams of a heart, and several pages of numbers. Even with insurance, he explained, the remaining cost of the surgery would be close to $70,000. $70,000! I stared at that number while Lucas giggled softly to himself in the corner, making his dinosaur stomp across the arm of the chair. The doctor kept explaining the condition. Something about a congenital defect that had worsened over time. Something about blood flow and valves and how surgery needed to happen soon. Weeks, not months. But all I could think about was the number printed in bold near the bottom of the page. $70,000. My son's life had suddenly become a bill I had no idea how to pay. And the only people who might have been able to help me were the very people who had spent most of my life pretending I didn't really matter. When we left the cardiology office, the hallway felt colder than the rest of the hospital. Fluorescent lights hummed softly above us, while nurses moved quietly between patient rooms. Lucas walked beside me carrying his small backpack. "Mom?" he asked. "Does this mean I can't play soccer for a while?" I forced a smile I didn't feel. "Maybe just for a little bit," I said. He nodded thoughtfully, as if taking a break from soccer was the biggest problem in the world. I wished that was the only problem. A hospital financial coordinator met with me in a small office down the hall. She spoke kindly, but directly. People in her job had learned how to discuss frightening numbers without sounding cruel. Insurance would cover a large portion of the procedure, she explained. But there would still be a remaining balance. A deposit would be required before the surgery could be scheduled. Payment plans were available. But the hospital needed confirmation soon to secure an operating slot within the safe time frame recommended by the cardiologist. As she spoke, she glanced at Lucas through the glass window of the office. He was sitting in the waiting area, flipping through a children's book. Many families in situations like this rely on relatives for help, she said gently. Relatives. Family. The word stayed in my mind long after the meeting ended. Outside in the parking lot, Lucas climbed into the back seat of our old sedan and buckled himself in. "Can we still get ice cream?" he asked. I laughed quietly. "Yeah," I said. "We can still get ice cream." He smiled and leaned his head against the window as we drove away from the hospital. Within 10 minutes, he had fallen asleep in the back seat. At a red light, I glanced in the rearview mirror and watched his chest rise and fall gently as he slept. I wondered if his heart was beating normally right now, or if something inside his chest was already struggling. The thought made my grip tighten on the steering wheel. By the time we reached our small house on the south side of Des Moines, the sun was already starting to set. I carried Lucas inside and let him continue sleeping on the couch while cartoons played quietly on the television. Then I sat down at the kitchen table. The hospital folder lay in front of me. I opened my laptop and began making a list. Savings account balance. Emergency fund. Credit card limits. Even if I used every dollar I had saved over the last 10 years, I would still be tens of thousands short. Medical loan websites appeared in search results. Crowdfunding platforms. Charity organizations. But most of them required time for approval. And time was exactly what Lucas didn't have. The doctor had made that clear. Weeks, not months. Lucas stirred on the couch and called out sleepily. "Mom, I'm here," I said. "Are you scared?" he asked. The question caught me off guard. I walked into the living room and sat beside him. "A little," I admitted. He reached over and squeezed my hand. "It's okay," he said confidently. "I'm brave." I smiled and kissed the top of his head. "You are?" I whispered. Later that night, After Lucas had gone to bed, I sat alone at the kitchen table again, staring at my phone. There was one option left. The option I had spent years avoiding. My parents lived less than 20 minutes away in one of the nicest neighborhoods in the city. Money had never been a problem for them, but asking them for help meant stepping back into a family dynamic I had worked very hard to escape. Growing up, there had always been two versions of our family. The version that existed for my younger brother Travis, and the one that existed for the rest of us. Travis had always been the golden child, the future businessman, the son my parents believed would someday build something important. The rest of us had simply lived around that expectation. I stared at my phone for a long time before finally turning off the kitchen light. Tomorrow night I would go to their house. I would sit at their table, and I would ask them for help paying for Lucas's surgery. Because pride didn't matter anymore. Only my son did. But as I walked down the hallway toward Lucas's bedroom, another thought crept into my mind. If my parents said no, I had absolutely no idea what I was going to do next. The next evening, I drove Lucas across town toward my parents' house. Their neighborhood always felt like a different world from mine. The streets were wider, the houses larger, and every lawn looked perfectly trimmed as if someone inspected them every morning. Lucas sat in the back seat watching the trees pass by the window. "Are we going to Grandma's?" he asked. "Yeah," I said. "She invited us for dinner." That part wasn't exactly a lie. My mother often mentioned dinner whenever she called, though most of the time those invitations felt more like obligations than warmth. Lucas didn't notice the tension in my voice. He was too busy talking about dinosaurs and his soccer team. I wished the biggest problem in our lives was whether he could still play next Saturday. As we turned onto my parents' street, the familiar knot tightened in my stomach. Their house stood at the end of a long curved driveway, the same place I had grown up in. From the outside it still looked perfect. Tall windows, a wide porch, and expensive landscaping that my father loved showing off to neighbors. But every time I came here as an adult, I felt like a guest in someone else's life. Lucas ran ahead of me when we reached the front door. My mother opened it before I even knocked. "There's my handsome grandson," she said quickly, pulling Lucas into a hug. She barely looked at me before turning back toward the house. "Dinner's almost ready." Inside, everything looked exactly the same as it had for years. The polished wooden floors reflected the warm lights from the ceiling. The large dining table filled most of the room. The walls were covered with framed photographs. Almost all of them featured Travis. Travis graduating from college. Travis standing beside my father at some business conference. Travis shaking hands with local politicians. My mother had always called him the future of the family. Lucas climbed onto a chair at the table and started coloring on a napkin while I helped set out plates. My father was already seated at the head of the table. A few minutes later, the front door opened again. Travis walked in, talking loudly on his phone. No. The shipment has to arrive by Friday," he said as he paced across the room. "I've got customers asking about the inventory already." He ended the call and dropped into the chair across from me. "Busy week," he said proudly. My father smiled. "That's what happens when you're building a real business." Dinner had barely started when my father cleared his throat and lifted his glass. "I have some good news to share tonight," he said. Travis leaned back in his chair with a confident grin, like someone who already knew the announcement. "I've decided to make a major investment in Travis's new shop," my father continued. My mother clapped her hands together happily. "That's wonderful," she said. Travis launched into an excited explanation of the store. Outdoor equipment, camping supplies, fishing gear. He talked about expansion plans and future locations while my father nodded proudly beside him. Listening to them felt strange, because every number Travis mentioned sounded larger than the number still echoing in my mind. $70,000. The amount I needed to save my son's life. By the time the conversation slowed, my hands were shaking. I set my fork down on the table. "I actually came tonight because I need to talk to you about something," I said. The room grew quiet. My father looked at me expectantly. I explained Lucas's diagnosis. The heart condition. The surgery. The doctor's warning that we couldn't wait long. My voice felt heavier with every word. For a moment, no one said anything. Then my father leaned back calmly. "I'm sorry Lucas isn't feeling well," he said. "But I just invested a large amount into Travis's shop." He said it like a simple financial statement, not a refusal to help his grandson. My mother waved her hand lightly. "Kids get sick all the time," she said. "They bounce back." I stared at her, unsure if she had actually heard what I said. "The doctor said the surgery is urgent," I replied. But she had already turned toward Travis again. "So when does the grand opening happen?" she asked. Travis smiled. "Next month. Hopefully." Then he glanced back at me. "You're making this sound like the end of the world," he said. I waited for him to soften the comment, to say something supportive. Instead, he shrugged. "Look, if the kid doesn't make it," he said casually, "that's fate." The words landed on the table like broken glass. For a moment, no one spoke. Even my father shifted uncomfortably. Lucas kept coloring quietly beside me, thankfully not paying attention. Something inside my chest cracked in a way I couldn't quite explain. I stood up slowly from the table. "I think we should go," I said quietly. No one tried to stop me. Lucas grabbed his jacket and followed me to the door. Behind us, Travis had already started talking about supply orders again. Outside, the night air felt cold against my face. Lucas climbed into the back seat while I started the engine. "Mom," he said softly, "are we leaving already?" "Yeah," I said. "We're heading home." As we pulled away from the driveway, two terrifying thoughts settled into my mind at the same time. My family had just refused to help save my son's life, and I had absolutely no idea where I would find the money now. But what I didn't know yet was that someone else in my family had already heard about that dinner, and before the night was over, he would be standing at my front door. The drive home from my parents' house felt longer than usual. Lucas sat quietly in the back seat, still holding the napkin he had been coloring on during dinner. The streetlights passed across his face every few seconds as we drove, lighting his small features in brief flashes. For once, he wasn't talking. Children notice more than adults think. Even when they don't understand the words, they can feel when something in the room changes. After a few minutes, he spoke softly. "Mom, are Grandpa and Grandma mad at you?" The question hurt more than anything Travis had said at the table. "No," I told him gently. Everyone was just tired. Lucas seemed satisfied with the answer. He leaned his head against the window and watched the passing houses. But inside my chest, the truth felt heavier. My parents hadn't been angry. They simply hadn't cared enough to help. When we reached home, Lucas dropped his backpack by the couch and turned on cartoons. The bright colors filled the living room while he curled up under a blanket like any ordinary evening. But nothing about that night felt ordinary to me. I walked into the kitchen and stared at the stack of hospital papers waiting on the table. The numbers hadn't changed. The deadline hadn't changed. And neither had the amount of money I needed. I opened my laptop again and started searching. Medical loans, charity programs, crowdfunding websites. Every option looked slow and uncertain. Approval timelines, eligibility reviews, verification processes. Lucas didn't have time for any of that. The doctor had made that clear. Weeks, not months. The thought crept into my mind slowly but firmly. What if I really couldn't find the money in time? What if the problem wasn't medical at all? What if it was simply financial? The idea made my stomach twist. Lucas looked over from the couch. "Mom, are you working again?" he asked. "Just checking something," I said. He nodded and went back to watching his cartoon dinosaurs. I tried to focus on the screen again, but my mind kept returning to the same terrifying possibility. I might actually lose my son because I couldn't afford to save him. A loud knock on the front door broke my thoughts. I looked at the clock. It was nearly 10 o'clock. I wasn't expecting anyone. For a moment, I wondered if I had imagined it. Then the knock came again, louder this time. Lucas looked up from the couch. "Mom, I'll get it," I said. When I opened the door, I froze. Daniel stood on the porch under the yellow porch light. My older brother looked the same as he always did, tall, slightly hunched from years of construction work, wearing dusty boots and a worn jacket. Daniel had never fit into the version of success my parents admired. While Travis studied business plans and investments, Daniel spent his days building things with his hands. Because of that, my parents often treated him like a disappointment. But Daniel had always been the only one in our family who regularly checked on me. He stepped inside quietly and glanced toward the living room. Lucas waved excitedly. "Uncle Dan." Daniel smiled and ruffled his hair. "How's the little guy doing?" he asked. His voice was calm, but I noticed the concern in his eyes. I hesitated for a moment. Apparently the story from dinner hadn't reached him yet, so I told him. I explained the doctor's diagnosis. The surgery, the cost, the conversation with our parents, and Travis's comment, "If he doesn't make it, that's fate." Daniel's jaw tightened when he heard that part. "That sounds like him," he muttered quietly. For the first time that evening, someone in my family sounded angry for Lucas. Daniel reached into the inside pocket of his jacket. He pulled out a small envelope and placed it on the kitchen table. "I don't have much," he said, "but this is what I've got." Inside was cash. Not a huge amount, but enough that I immediately understood what it meant. This wasn't spare money. This was probably most of what Daniel had saved. I tried to slide the envelope back toward him. "Daniel, I can't take this." He pushed it back. "Yes, you can." His voice was steady. "He's my nephew." The moment felt strange. My parents lived in a house worth hundreds of thousands of dollars. Travis was starting a brand new business with their investment. And yet, the only person offering help tonight was the brother who had the least. Daniel leaned back in his chair after a moment. "You asked Mom and Dad for help tonight, didn't you?" he asked. I nodded. He sighed quietly. I figured. There was something unusual about the way he said it, like he had expected the entire situation. Then he said something that made me look up. "You know Travis's shop?" he asked. "The one Dad just invested in." "Yeah," I said. Daniel tapped the table slowly with his fingers. "I was doing some renovation work there last week." He paused for a moment, and let's just say, things didn't look exactly the way Travis described them. I frowned. "What do you mean?" Daniel shrugged slightly. "I'm not saying anything for sure yet," he said. "But I saw some paperwork and heard a few conversations that didn't add up." He stood up and pulled on his jacket again. "I'm going to check a few things tomorrow," he added. I watched him walk toward the door. "Daniel, what are you talking about?" He paused before stepping outside. Then he glanced back toward Lucas, who had fallen asleep on the couch with the television still playing. Daniel lowered his voice. "Don't lose hope yet," he said. "Sometimes the person who thinks they're the smartest in the room is actually the one making the biggest mistake." After he left, the house fell quiet again. I stood in the kitchen staring at the envelope of cash beside the hospital paperwork. For the first time since the doctor's office, a small spark of possibility appeared in my mind. Because somewhere behind Travis's perfect new business, Daniel seemed to think there was a secret waiting to be discovered. The next morning started quietly. Lucas sat at the kitchen table eating cereal while cartoons played in the living room. Sunlight came through the window and landed on the stack of hospital papers still spread across the table. From the outside, it probably looked like an ordinary morning. But inside my head, everything felt different. The doctor's voice still echoed in my mind. "Weeks, not months." Lucas hummed to himself while pushing cereal around his bowl. "Mom, do dinosaurs have hearts?" he suddenly asked. I blinked, pulled out of my thoughts. "Yeah," I said. "Big ones." "Probably?" He nodded thoughtfully, satisfied with the answer. I watched him for a moment longer than usual. Every small movement suddenly felt important. Every breath. Every second. I realized I had started measuring time differently. Not in days or weeks, but in how long I had left to save my son. My phone rang late that morning. The number on the screen was the hospital. My chest tightened before I even answered. The financial coordinator's voice came through the speaker. She sounded polite, but serious. "I just wanted to follow up about Lucas's surgery schedule," she said. "The surgical team had limited openings over the next few weeks. If we wanted to secure a date within the safe medical window, the deposit would need to be arranged soon. Very soon." I thanked her and ended the call. For several seconds, I just sat there staring at the wall. The clock had officially started ticking. Around noon, my phone rang again. This time it was Daniel. His voice sounded focused. "I did some digging this morning," he said. My stomach tightened. "What kind of digging?" "The kind that makes me think Travis's new shop isn't exactly what he told everyone it was." I leaned against the kitchen counter. "What do you mean?" "I'll explain," Daniel said. "But you should come see something first." He told me where to meet him. An hour later, I was driving across town toward the strip mall where Travis's new store had opened. From the road, the building looked impressive. Large glass windows, bright outdoor banners, a big sign with the store name hanging over the entrance. It looked exactly like the kind of successful business my father loved bragging about. Daniel's pickup truck was parked behind the building near the delivery area. He stepped out when he saw my car. "You've seen the front," he said. "Now let me show you the back." There was something serious in his voice. Daniel walked toward the loading area behind the store. Several cardboard boxes were stacked near the back door. Some looked old and dusty. Others had shipping labels from companies I didn't recognize. Daniel pointed toward them. "Those deliveries have been sitting here for weeks," he said. "Why?" I asked. He shrugged. "Because the suppliers haven't been paid yet." I frowned. "What do you mean they haven't been paid?" "I mean exactly that." Daniel explained that while he had been repairing part of the ceiling inside the store last week, he overheard Travis arguing with suppliers on the phone. Late payments, missed deadlines, inventory delays. None of it sounded like the booming business Travis had described at dinner. Daniel also noticed something else. A lot of the merchandise on the shelves wasn't actually owned by the store. Instead, the suppliers were letting Travis sell the products on consignment, which meant the store didn't pay for them until after they sold. "Basically," Daniel said, "the place looks full, but most of the inventory isn't even his yet." That made my stomach tighten. It meant Travis's business might be balancing on borrowed time. Daniel opened the passenger door of his truck and pulled out a folded sheet of paper. "I shouldn't really have this," he admitted, "but it was sitting on Travis's desk when I was fixing the lights." He handed it to me. It was a financial document. Loan paperwork, interest rates, payment schedules. I scanned the page slowly. The numbers were far larger than I expected. "These loans are huge," I said quietly. Daniel nodded. "Yeah." Then I noticed the line labeled collateral. My eyes stopped moving. The words felt heavy on the page. Residential property. Address listed. My parents' house. I looked up sharply. Did Mom and Dad agree to this? Daniel rubbed the back of his neck. "I don't know," he said. "But if they signed those papers without understanding what they were backing..." He didn't finish the sentence. "He didn't need to. If Travis failed to repay the loans, the bank could claim the property tied to them." My parents' house. The house they had lived in for over 20 years. A memory flashed through my mind. Growing up, my father always talked about Travis as the one who would build something great, the son who would take the family forward. Daniel and I had always stood quietly beside that dream. Now I looked down at the document again. If Daniel was right, Travis's business wasn't a success story. It was a gamble, and the entire family might be the ones paying the price. I folded the paper slowly. "So what do we do?" I asked. Daniel leaned against his truck. "I think we need to find out exactly how deep this goes," he said. "Because if Travis had convinced our parents to sign those loan papers without explaining the risks, then the perfect little business my father had proudly announced at dinner might not just be struggling. It might actually be illegal." After Daniel showed me the document behind Travis's shop, I drove home in complete silence. The late afternoon sun hung low over the streets of Des Moines, casting long shadows across the road. Normally, I liked that quiet time of day, when the city slowed down and people started heading home. But that afternoon, my mind was racing. Less than 2 days ago, my only problem had been figuring out how to pay for Lucas's heart surgery. Now, another possibility had appeared. A dangerous one. If Travis had really taken massive loans using my parents' house as collateral, then the entire family might be standing on the edge of a financial disaster. And for the first time since that terrible dinner, a strange thought crossed my mind. What if the person everyone trusted most in our family was the one hiding the biggest lie? When I walked through the front door, Lucas was sitting on the living room floor building a dinosaur park with his plastic toys. "Mom," he said excitedly, "look at this one." He held up a bright green dinosaur and made roaring sounds. "This one is the boss dinosaur." I knelt down beside him and smiled. "That one looks pretty powerful." Lucas placed the toy carefully in the middle of his little plastic park. For a moment, I just watched him play. The doctor's words echoed in my mind again. Urgent surgery. Weeks. Not months. I imagined the hospital room, the operating table, the monitors, the possibility that I might not solve this in time. Nothing in the world mattered more than keeping that little boy alive. Not family pride. Not old arguments. Not even the possibility of tearing my family apart. Later that night, after Lucas had fallen asleep, I sat alone at the kitchen table again. The hospital paperwork sat in one pile. The photo I had taken of Travis's loan document glowed on my phone screen. Two completely different problems. But somehow they were beginning to feel connected. If Travis had manipulated our parents into backing risky loans, exposing the truth might destroy whatever remained of our family. But if I stayed silent, he might continue putting them in danger. And another thought kept creeping into my mind. The same brother who laughed about my son possibly dying might be hiding a financial mess that could destroy our parents' lives. For the first time, revealing the truth didn't feel like revenge. It felt like responsibility. My phone buzzed on the table. Daniel's name appeared on the screen. "I talked to someone," he said when I answered. "Someone who understands contracts better than I do. A lawyer." Yeah. Apparently, Daniel had shown the document to a lawyer friend earlier that afternoon. The lawyer had taken one look at it and asked for more information. Loan agreements, investor disclosures, partnership paperwork. If Travis didn't explain the risks properly when Mom and Dad signed those documents, Daniel said, this could actually be fraud. The word hung in the air. Fraud. Suddenly, the situation felt much bigger than family drama. Now it involved the law. Daniel suggested we gather more information before confronting anyone. If Travis was hiding financial problems, there would be other signs. Unpaid suppliers, late invoices, loan notices. Daniel had already contacted one of the contractors who worked on the store renovation. Apparently, several suppliers had been complaining about delayed payments, which meant Travis might already be falling behind. The perfect business success story my father bragged about might actually be collapsing behind the scenes. About an hour later, Daniel called again. His voice sounded more serious this time. "My lawyer looked at the document again," he said. "And he noticed something." "What?" "There might be more than one loan." I sat up straighter in my chair. "What do you mean more than one?" "The numbers suggest multiple loans tied to the same collateral. My parents' house. Not just one risk. Several. If Travis defaulted on those payments, the bank could go after the property listed in the agreements. My parents' house. The same house where they had refused to help pay for Lucas's surgery. The same house where Travis had laughed at the idea of fate deciding my son's life. The irony wasn't lost on me. Daniel's voice softened slightly. "So what do you want to do with this?" I didn't answer immediately, because there were really only two choices. Ignore everything and hope the situation somehow fixed itself. Or confront Travis and expose whatever he was hiding. But that could tear the entire family apart. Then I remembered Travis leaning back in his chair at dinner, laughing. If he doesn't make it, that's fate. Something inside me settled. "I think Mom and Dad deserve to know the truth," I said quietly. There was silence on the line for a moment. Then Daniel sighed. "If we do that," he said, Travis is going to explode. I know, because once our parents discovered what their golden child might have done, the next family meeting was going to look very different from the last one. The next evening, Daniel and I drove to our parents' house together. The sun had already started to set, turning the sky a dull orange over the quiet suburban streets. I had been to this house thousands of times in my life, but that night felt completely different. The last time I came here, I had arrived desperate for help, desperate to save my son. Tonight I was arriving with something else. The truth. Daniel parked his truck in the driveway, and for a moment neither of us moved. You sure about this? He asked. I looked down at the folder of documents resting in my lap. Loan agreements, supplier invoices, payment notices, everything pointing to the same reality. Travis's business was built on borrowed money, and our parents' house was tied to it. Yes, I said quietly. We walked inside together. My parents were sitting in the living room watching television. The familiar room looked exactly the same as always. Large leather couch, polished coffee table, family photos lining the walls. Travis was there too, leaning back in a chair while scrolling through his phone. He looked up when we entered. Well, this is interesting, he said. My father muted the television. What's going on? He asked. Daniel didn't sit down. Instead, he placed the folder on the coffee table. You should take a look at these, he said calmly. Travis frowned immediately. What is this supposed to be? My father opened the folder slowly. At first, his expression was simply confused. Then he turned the page. And another. His eyebrows tightened. My mother leaned closer to see. What are we looking at? She asked. These are loan agreements connected to Travis's shop, I said. Travis scoffed. Seriously? I ignored him. And according to the paperwork, those loans are backed by your house. The room went silent. My father looked up sharply. That can't be right. Travis laughed nervously. Of course it's not right, he said quickly. They're misunderstanding something. My mother nodded immediately. That's what it sounds like, she said. Then she looked directly at me. Hannah, you shouldn't bring accusations like this without understanding how business works. The words felt painfully familiar. Growing up, every disagreement followed the same pattern. Travis was trusted. Everyone else was questioned. Daniel remained calm. He reached into the folder and slid another document across the table. These are unpaid supplier invoices, he said. Several companies have been waiting weeks for payment. Travis's smile disappeared. My father studied the papers more carefully. You told me the store was already profitable, he said slowly. Travis shifted uncomfortably in his chair. It will be, he said quickly. It just takes time to build momentum. Daniel tapped another section of the document. Look at this part. My father adjusted his glasses and leaned closer. He read the paragraph silently. Then he read it again. What does this mean? My mother asked. Daniel answered quietly. It means if Travis can't make the loan payments, the bank can claim the property listed as collateral. My father looked up. Our house. Daniel nodded. The room grew very quiet. For the first time. My parents looked uncertain. Travis suddenly stood up. This is ridiculous, he snapped. You two are trying to sabotage my business. His eyes shifted toward me. Oh, I get it now, he said bitterly. You couldn't get money for your kid's surgery. So now you're trying to drag everyone else down with you. His words were cruel. But this time I didn't look away. Because now the truth was sitting on the table. And everyone could see it. My father slowly closed the folder. For years he had looked at Travis with pride. That night he looked at him with something very different. How much debt are we talking about? He asked. Travis didn't answer. He just stared at the floor. My father repeated the question. How much? Travis rubbed his face. It's normal business financing? He muttered. That's not what I asked. My father said. The silence that followed felt heavier than anything else in the room. Finally, Travis spoke. The number he said made my mother gasp. It was far more money than anyone expected. Most of the shop hadn't been funded by my father's investment at all. It had been funded by loans. Loans secured by my parents' property. My father leaned back slowly in his chair. "You told us we were just signing some routine paperwork," my mother said quietly. Daniel shook his head. "No bank puts houses on contracts for routine paperwork." Travis opened his mouth to argue again. But before he could speak, his phone started ringing. He looked down at the screen and immediately declined the call. Then it rang again. And again. Daniel glanced at the phone. "Supplier?" he asked calmly. Travis didn't answer. Finally, he grabbed the phone and walked into the kitchen. We could hear the conversation from the living room. Raised voices. Angry demands. Words like shipment and payment floating through the hallway. My father stared down at the documents again. For the first time since I was a child, he didn't look proud of Travis. He looked uncertain. And maybe even afraid. Daniel stood quietly beside the table. "There's something else you should know," he said. My father looked up. "What else?" Daniel hesitated for a moment. "The lawyer I talked to said something important." He took a breath. "If Travis didn't fully explain the risks when you signed those loan papers, it could legally be considered fraud." The word landed in the room like thunder. And when Travis walked back into the living room a moment later, he looked genuinely scared. The word fraud seemed to echo through the room long after Daniel said it. No one moved. My father was still sitting on the couch, the folder of documents resting heavily in his hands. My mother stared at Travis as if waiting for him to laugh and explain everything away. But Travis didn't laugh. For the first time in my life. My younger brother looked cornered. "That's ridiculous," he muttered. His voice sounded weaker than usual. Daniel didn't raise his voice. He simply repeated what the lawyer had explained. "If you didn't clearly explain the risks before using their house as collateral, it could legally be considered fraud." Travis rubbed the back of his neck. "You're blowing this out of proportion," he said. But no one seemed convinced anymore. My father slowly stood up. For years I had watched him defend Travis in every argument. Every mistake. Every questionable decision. That night was different. "How much money did you borrow?" he asked quietly. Travis looked away. "It's just normal business financing," he said. My father didn't move. "How much debt?" The question hung in the air. Travis hesitated. Then he finally said the number. My mother gasped softly. The amount was far larger than anyone had expected. The investment my father proudly announced at dinner had only been a small piece of the total. Most of the business had been built on borrowed money. Before anyone could respond, Travis's phone began ringing again. He glanced down at the screen and rejected the call. A few seconds later it rang again. Daniel leaned slightly forward. "Supplier?" he asked calmly. Travis clenched his jaw. The phone rang a third time. This time he answered. "Yeah," he snapped as he walked into the kitchen. The rest of us sat in silence. From the hallway we could hear the conversation. A man's voice on the other end was clearly angry. Words like shipment delay and unpaid invoice floated into the living room. Travis lowered his voice. But the tension in his tone was obvious. My father slowly flipped through the documents again. "This says our property secures the loan," he murmured. My mother looked pale. "You told us it was just a signature for paperwork," she said. Daniel shook his head. "No bank asks for a house as collateral for routine paperwork." My father stared down at the page. For the first time in years, the certainty he always carried about Travis seemed to disappear. The golden child suddenly looked far less impressive. Travis returned from the kitchen a moment later looking furious. "This is unbelievable," he snapped. "You two are trying to destroy my business." His eyes landed on me. "Oh, I see what this is," he said bitterly. "You couldn't get money for your kid's surgery, so now you're trying to drag everyone down with you." The accusation hung in the air. But before I could respond, my father spoke. "Enough." The single word stopped everyone. He stood slowly and looked directly at Travis. "For years we trusted you," he said. "And now we might lose our home because of your decisions." Travis didn't answer. My mother sank down onto the couch. Clearly shaken. "I can't believe this," she whispered. The perfect image of our family was finally cracking. At that moment, my phone started ringing. The screen showed the number of the children's hospital. My heart jumped. "Excuse me," I said, stepping outside onto the front porch. The evening air felt cool against my face. I answered the call. The cardiology coordinator sounded cheerful. "I have some good news," she said. The hospital had submitted an urgent appeal to the insurance provider after reviewing Lucas's case again. The appeal had been approved. A much larger portion of the surgery would now be covered. The remaining cost was suddenly far smaller than before. For a moment I couldn't speak. "Are you still there?" she asked. "Yes," I said quickly. "Yes, I'm here." When the call ended, I stood on the porch for a few seconds trying to process the news. For the first time since the diagnosis, hope returned. I walked back inside. Daniel looked up immediately. "What happened?" "The insurance appeal was approved," I said. "The surgery is covered, mostly." Daniel broke into a wide smile. "That's incredible." Then he added something I didn't expect. "My crew at the construction company heard about Lucas," he said. "They started collecting money today. Apparently, several of his co-workers had quietly begun raising donations. Not huge amounts, but enough to help cover the remaining costs. The people who had the least money were once again the first to help." My father looked at me carefully. "And whatever remains," he said slowly, "we'll help cover it." The words came quietly, but they carried weight. They came too late to erase what happened at dinner. Still, it was the first time my parents had acknowledged the seriousness of the situation. Daniel nodded slowly. "Good," he said. Travis stood silently near the doorway, his earlier confidence completely gone. The truth had finally caught up with him. As Daniel and I walked toward the door a few minutes later, the house felt very different from the night of that terrible dinner. My parents knew what Travis had done. The bank would soon know too. And Lucas's surgery was finally within reach. Outside, Daniel opened the door of his truck. "If Travis really falsified those loan documents," he said quietly, "the consequences are just getting started." I looked back at the house once more. For years, Travis had believed he could do anything without consequences. But that night, for the first time in his life, the future didn't belong to him anymore. The morning of Lucas's surgery arrived before I felt ready for it. Hospitals are strangely quiet early in the morning. The hallways echo softly. The lights seem a little dimmer, and every sound feels louder than it should. Lucas sat beside me in the waiting room, wearing a tiny hospital bracelet around his wrist. He looked more curious than afraid. "Mom?" he asked, swinging his legs gently from the chair. "Are the doctors going to fix my heart today?" I knelt down in front of him and held his hands. "Yes," I said. "They're going to make it stronger." A nurse arrived a few minutes later and gently called his name. Lucas stood up and grabbed the small stuffed dinosaur Daniel had given him the night before. Before disappearing through the hallway doors, he turned and waved at me. "See you after my super heart," he said proudly. The doors closed behind him, and suddenly the waiting room felt enormous and empty. Daniel sat beside me the entire time. He had insisted on coming, even though it meant missing a full day of work. For the first hour, neither of us spoke much. The clock on the wall ticked loudly. Every minute felt like an hour. Finally, Daniel leaned forward with his elbows on his knees. "You know," he said quietly, "when Lucas grows up, he's going to realize how hard you fought for him." I shook my head. "I just did what any parent would do." Daniel gave a small smile. "Not every parent," he said. I knew what he meant. The memory of that dinner still lingered in my mind. The moment my father refused. The moment my mother brushed it aside. The moment Travis laughed and called it fate. Those words still felt sharp. But that morning something else mattered more. Lucas was in surgery, and all I could do was wait. After several long hours, the doors at the end of the hallway finally opened. The surgeon walked toward us, removing his surgical mask. Daniel and I both stood up instantly. The doctor smiled. "The surgery went very well," he said. I didn't realize how tightly my hands had been clenched until that moment. The tension that had been living in my chest for weeks suddenly released. The doctor explained that the procedure had successfully repaired the defect. Lucas would need time to recover, but his prognosis was excellent. For the first time since that terrible day in the cardiology office, I could breathe again. Later that afternoon, I was allowed to see Lucas in recovery. He looked small in the hospital bed, surrounded by machines and monitors, but his chest rose and fell steadily. His heart was beating stronger than before. Daniel stood quietly near the door. When Lucas slowly opened his eyes, he looked around for a moment. Then he saw me. "Did I miss school?" he whispered. I laughed through tears. "Yeah," I said. "But I think your teacher will understand." Over the next few weeks, life slowly began returning to normal. Lucas recovered faster than the doctors expected. Within a month, he was already walking around the house with his usual energy. But while Lucas healed, things back at my parents' house were very different. The truth about Travis's business spread quickly once lawyers and banks became involved. Suppliers demanded their payments. Investigations began reviewing the loan documents. The shop that once looked so impressive started collapsing under the weight of its debts. My parents finally had to face something they had ignored for years. Their favorite son had built his success on reckless decisions and half-truths. The golden child wasn't so golden anymore. Through all of it, Daniel kept showing up. He visited Lucas often during recovery. Sometimes he brought small toys. Sometimes comic books. Sometimes he just sat on the couch telling stories about his construction crew. Lucas eventually started calling him Uncle Dan the hero. Daniel always laughed when he heard that. But I knew Lucas wasn't entirely wrong. Without Daniel's support, his money, his help, his steady presence, I might never have made it through those terrifying weeks. The brother everyone once considered the least successful had turned out to be the strongest person in the entire family. A few weeks after the surgery, my parents came to one of Lucas's follow-up appointments. They looked different than I remembered. Quieter, older somehow. My father stood beside Lucas's hospital bed for a long moment before speaking. "We should have listened to you sooner," he said quietly. It wasn't a dramatic apology, just a simple sentence. But it was the first honest moment we had shared in a long time. My mother hugged Lucas tightly before they left. It didn't erase the hurt from that dinner night. Some things take longer to heal than a heart surgery. But it was a beginning. Months later, Lucas returned to school and even started playing soccer again. Watching him run across the field during his first game back felt like witnessing a small miracle. Life had slowly found its balance again. But the experience changed the way I thought about family. For most of my life, I believed family meant blood. The people you grew up with. The people whose names matched yours. But that year taught me something very different. Family is the person who knocks on your door late at night with an envelope containing everything they have. Family is the person who sits beside you in a hospital waiting room while the future feels uncertain. Family is the one who stands up when everyone else stays seated. Sometimes the person with the least money turns out to be the richest in character. And sometimes the people we expect the most from are the ones who disappoint us the most. But those moments also reveal who truly belongs beside us. And that's something I will never forget. If you've ever gone through something like this, when the people you expected to support you didn't, but someone unexpected stepped up instead, I'd really love to hear your story. Share it in the comments. Your experience might help someone else realize they're not alone. And if stories about family, betrayal, and the unexpected ways life turns, the tables resonate with you, stay here with us and subscribe to the channel. Because sometimes the most powerful stories aren't about revenge. They're about discovering who truly stands beside you when everything falls apart.